time to invite Monika Marekova. Monika, she's a PhD student at Charles University. She studied Masaryk University in Brno, University of Oxford, Lincoln College. She studied also University on Freiburg and Laurentian University in Sudbury in Canada. She studied the Human Rights and the United Nations Graduate Student Program in Geneva. She is now a distance fellow at the Czech Center for Human Rights and Democratization, and she is also an attorney at law with her own practice, and she is also the member of Ethics Committee of Ministry of Transportation of the Czech Republic. Rich CV. So Monika, floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. So yes, I'm a PhD student, but I started my PhD after the 10 years of practice. I also, before I started my PhD, was in a research project at the Academy of Sciences already. And today I'm going to tell you something about the artificial intelligence and the bias in connection with artificial intelligence. First of all, I will tell you something about the definition of bias as such, but also in connection with the use of artificial intelligence, what it might cause, or how we could maybe avoid it. I will also tell you about the consequences and possible causes. I'm saying possible causes because, of course, if we knew the causes, then we would be able to avoid the bias as such, and so we are still trying to explore what are the real causes and how to avoid the unconscious bias in connection with artificial intelligence. I will introduce a few examples and also possible solutions to the situation, even though we are still trying to research them and to avoid unconscious bias in the process of development of artificial intelligence systems and their use. Firstly, you probably are aware what is bias. This is typically some discriminatory stereotypes which person have towards a group of other people. The problem is when we ourselves face ourselves as people which do not discriminate others, but we do it subconsciously. It is called a so-called unconscious bias. This means that I would not discriminate a person of race in the hiring process, but for example, if I go on a street during the night and I see a person of race, then all of a sudden I start to be aware subconsciously that a crime might happen or that there is something which is not okay. Or if I'm in a meeting and I see a lady in a dress walking in the room, unconsciously I do not recognize her as being the CEO of the company, but automatically I think that she would be probably assistant and offering me a coffee. And only after a few moments I'm able to realize that this is unconscious bias which we have, which is introduced in our genetics. This is something which we have through our learning process and which is basically how people developed, because we have some experience, and based on that experience we come to certain biases which help us originally, or used to help us to avoid danger or to know to which group of people we belong. But at the same time, in the current world, it actually causes discrimination. So the unconscious bias are social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside of their conscious decision-making process. If we form these stereotypes in our mind, then we are still able as thinking individuals to step back and to realize these. If I'm going through the CVs and I see foreign name and I think, okay, that might be a foreigner, this does not sound right, then I'm still able to think back and say, yeah, but this is my unconscious bias, and I'm going to look at all the people in the same way. the problem might happen that with artificial intelligence systems being used in the process, they do not have this kind of going back recognition of bias. And if they are just trained on data, which might have the bias in the data as such, they might reinforce the bias in the decision-making process. So what are the consequences of this is discrimination based on race, gender, age, social class, religion, or sexual orientation. But this does not end only with the discrimination as such, because if we are going to check people of race more often at the airports, for example, this is first of all race discrimination, but secondly, we are infringing with these people's freedom. We might be infringing with the right to privacy of certain people because they are going to be checked more often, because this is coming from the statistics and the bias of the system. When we are looking at the causes of the bias, there are usually two ways. First of all, it might be algorithm as such, that the developers have certain bias themselves, and they wire the algorithm in such a way that it actually takes, for example, white men more into consideration than women, or some other matters. And it might be actually correct in certain way. For example, if we are doing tests for dermatological tests, for example, which are specially for people of color, then of course it is actually okay to introduce the race in the algorithms. The problem is that if we actually introduce these types of conditions in algorithms where it has no place to be in. Another problem, and that is more often happening, is data. It might happen that the machine, when it is learning, is provided non-representative sample. For example, the face recognition systems, when they are learning, they take the basic set of photos, and usually they were provided previously more photos of white men than black men. And basically the face recognition systems, first of all, they recognize mostly white men, then white women, then black men, and then black women. And after a certain time, they realized that the face recognition cameras were not able to recognize black women as people because the system was fed with photos of white people more often, which caused the bias. And then, of course, if the cameras, for example, recognized black person but was not able to recognize that this is a person, it caused another problem. And at the same time, it might reflect pre-existing bias because the system learns from previous decisions, or it learns from internet, which is, for example, then when we provide CVs to the AI system selecting the CVs during the hiring process, and we told the system, oh, these are the good CVs and these are the bad CVs, and in the good CVs there is more men, then the system actually might reflect this pre-existing bias and might think, oh, it is a good thing to be a man, and I'm going to select more men as being better during this hiring process than women. And this might be also even not pointing out that these are good CVs or bad CVs. It might be that just the system is learning from internet or from the current world. For example, in IT, there is much more men working than women. So when the system is looking at the current current sphere of people working in IT, it might think, okay, it is better to be a man to work in the IT sector. So few examples I have already mentioned. Now, there are some other examples which might reinforce unconscious bias. Some of them are very easy to be removed, as for example, voice assistants. I think that this has already improved a lot in the past years, but when the voice assistants were introduced, firstly, they were introduced only with female voices, and which subconsciously reinforced the bias that a female is assistant working and serving to a man. Luckily, thanks to various protests and pointing this out, the companies have already started to introduce various voices and also introducing various accents also in English and voices of black people, for example, which very often are deeper and some other voices or accents. Then it might be in hiring process, which I have already mentioned, banking. And this is sometimes discussed a lot, whether it might be a good thing to provide certain condition in the picking up of a person to be provided a credit or not, or offering a credit or credit cards. There was a case when a married couple, man and husband and wife, they had one amount of their property together, and the lady was offered much less on her credit card, much less credit on her credit card than a man. And they brought a case against the company, which they were actually connected with. And then the company tried to figure out why it was caused that the man was offered much higher credit. It was very unclear how they tried to explain this. They said that the man had, on his part of account, had more regular income than the wife, but it should still not matter because their property was the same. And so this is something which companies should have better look at and which should be avoided, because this is reinforcing the bias as such. If women who are already disadvantaged would be provided less credit to, for example, start their own business, then of course they are unable to get out of their poverty. Another problem, which I'm not aware that would be used in the Czech Republic, but it has already been introduced in the USA, is the use of artificial intelligence systems in criminal justice. This might be, for example, that in the area of high crimes, the police is being sent more often. If the police is there more often, of course, they are going to find more criminal sites. So this is maybe something which already exists in here, even without the AI system. But more problematic, I found granting a parole to be released from prison. That if the system basically evaluates the area in which you are living, for example, how many people you are living with, what is your background, what is your race, and you are then evaluated and granted parole based on the likelihood whether you are going to commit the crime again or not, this is discriminatory. And this system was already in place in a few states in the US and now is being re-evaluated, because it would mean that if you are in a wrong box, I would say, then you're almost unable to get out of the box. Because if you are if you are not granted parole, or you are granted parole under stricter conditions, and the officers are going to check you upon much more often, then you are unable to find a proper job, and then basically the whole criminal justice problem is being reinforced in the areas with higher crime, and you are unable to get out of the vicious cycle. And then also, another example is selection of individuals for inspections, for example, at the airports, as I said, which might have impacts also in other freedoms as your right to move. Shortly, I'm going to introduce the possible solutions to the unconscious bias. So the problem with this is that we do not know what we do not know with unconscious bias. That's why it is unconscious bias. And that's why it is very hard to look for suitable and sustainable solution. Because up until now, what was happening was that the system was introduced, and then only you have found out that it is actually bias and that you need to do something about it, and then you went back to your data or to the algorithms and were trying to figure out what's going on. And we hope to do it the other way around, to basically be aware of what might happen and take some solutions already before the problem starts. One thing which might be introduced already now is that the imperfect processes would be avoided, because in those problematic situations, it was discovered that data used for learning were used also for testing very often, and in that way you were unable to discover the problem because you have fed the computer with certain data, it has learned, then you have tried it, and it worked, but then when you release it into the real world, you have realized that it does not work because it was trained and tested on the same set of data. Very often there is lack of social context in the companies which develop AI systems. It might be recommended that if you know that this is the area where the bias already exists at the moment, for example, even nowadays people have some bias when they read a name of person in the hiring process which sounds somehow differently, then you might figure out that most probably this would be reinforced by the AI system as well. And so you might try to take some preemptive solutions to the situation. Okay. And then it is problematic, what is the definition of fairness as such, even nowadays, because you might think sometimes it might be actually good to look at different situations differently and at the same situations in the same way. But for example, as if there is a person who is usually not paying the credit back, it is right not to provide the credit to the person. So it might be hard to figure out what is the balance when there might be different treatment and where there might not be different treatment. And so this should be introduced in a fair way to the AI system. And lastly, there should be emphasis on the removing of bias in private sector, so basically in all of the developments, and maybe in regulation as well, as was already very shortly mentioned. So thank you very much. I'm not sure whether we have enough time for questions, but if you have any question, do not hesitate to write me to my email address, and it was a pleasure to speak here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. I think there's two aspects that I think are really important. The one, unconscious bias, relates it to the human system, right? I think maybe unwanted bias might be a better term from my perspective, because it is a social decision of what we don't want to accept. And what is it that let's take, for instance, the gender part, right? What would be an unbiased distribution between male and female? Is that the 52% female because that's the number worldwide, right? Or is it, let's say in the IT industry, the number of people that leave university is, I don't know, 25% or whatever it is. Would that be the right number of females in what that we strive for? So I think it's really the bias that we want is a social construct, right? And is a social decision by us what we want, right? Let's say you could ask for unbiased with regard to the latitude where people are born, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? Probably that is irrelevant for our question. So I think it's really a conscious decision of what we aim for. That's the one aspect. The other aspect that I think that is hardly ever mentioned in the context of gender, for example, right? For white people, if you take a picture of a white person, you have drastically higher contrast than for a black face, right? There's less light there. There's the contrast, the signal is just way worse to work with, right? And so there is a technical issue there. We might actually need to do more work to even get any signal and even get a good, it might actually be impossible to be unbiased because for technical reasons. So there are very interesting aspects that I think are not enough in the discussion. I don't want to excuse the gender bias. There's a lot we can do, right? But there are also hard technical limits of what can be done. And I think these aspects should be probably better represented in the current discussion.
Thanks. I will start with the second question or comment. So I think that it might be correct, your assumption that it might be hard to recognize someone with darker skin because of the reflections, I think you said. But at the same time, if we actually aim to recognize these people, the system is able to do it. And they have already found out that the system is able to recognize even the types of animals, so which I think are even much more harder to recognize than human faces. The system is able to recognize a face which has a face mask if we actually develop it. And in China, they just aimed at it and they were able to develop it. So I think this is one point. If we actually aimed at it, we are able to do it. It just might be a bit harder and not take just the first set which we have from the computer. And your first question or comment, I actually agree with it, that it might be some certain type of social construct, and it was actually on my last slide when I said, what is the definition of fairness? Sometimes it is really even hard for us to decide what is fair or what would be fair, but as people, I think we are still able to somehow balance the fairness better than the computer, and it is really hard to keep it balanced in the machine because we are still able to recognize this small difference between the almost same cases, while the machine is not able to do it. The machine just looks at the outcome of the statistics. And, but you are correct, it is hard to basically decide this.
Thank you very much.